The Grand Hall at Christie's in London used to be the heart of global capitalism. In the room where billionaire rivalries once electrified the air, a hollow silence now reigned. It was early 2026, and the mahogany podium stood as a monument to a vanishing era. Julian Thorne gripped its edge, his knuckles turning white. He was an auctioneer whose DNA was woven into high-stakes sales. Yet today, he looked out at a crowd that broke his heart. The seats weren't filled with titans of industry or reclusive heirs. Instead, tourists and influencers live-streamed for audiences who couldn't afford a single frame on the wall. The golden age of the public auction hadn't just faded. It had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest. Julian saw the diamond necklace on display as bait that no one was taking. His grandfather sold to kings. His father had shifted private equity. But Julian felt like a ghost presiding over a graveyard. He wasn't just mourning the spectacle. He was haunted by a mathematical impossibility. On paper, the world had never been wealthier. Trillions were circulating, yet the great auction houses were starving. The money hadn't vanished. It had simply moved out of the light. Julian needed to know where the power had gone. He knew the elite hadn't stopped buying. They had just stopped letting anyone watch. This exodus was triggered by legislative hammers in late 2025. The Global Tax Transparency Act had stripped away the veils of offshore accounts, but the real predator was the AI. New wealth trackers, sophisticated algorithms developed by transparency watchdogs, monitored every public transaction in real time. The moment a gavel hit the wood, the buyer's entire financial history was dissected by software and leaked to the press within seconds. Public bidding had become a legal liability, a beacon for unwanted scrutiny in a world where being ultra-wealthy was increasingly viewed as a moral failing. Before we continue this exploration of the shadows, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Julian understood the fear better than most. He had seen the casualties of this new era firsthand. He remembered the night the world changed for his clients. It was the summer of 2025, during a high-profile art gala. A tech billionaire, eager for the status only a masterpiece could provide, outbid a sovereign wealth fund for a $100 million Picasso. The room erupted in applause, but the celebration lasted less than an hour. By the time the billionaire reached his limousine, the wealth trackers had flagged the purchase. An automated audit was triggered instantly, linking the funds to a disputed mineral deal. Within 48 hours, the man was cancelled by his board, his assets were frozen, and the Picasso was seized. It was a brutal execution. The message to the elite was clear: if you show your hand, the world will cut it off. This humiliation transformed the psychology of the global elite. The primal urge for status was being overwritten by survival. The ultra-rich no longer wanted to be envied. They wanted to be invisible. They traded super yachts for nondescript research vessels and penthouses for fortified compounds. Julian watched as his father, a man who once thrived in the limelight, grew distant and secretive, eventually disappearing from the public eye. The conflict was no longer about who had the most, but who could hide the most. Julian felt the weight of his legacy crumbling. He was a man trained to shout prices, living in a world that had suddenly gone quiet. Returning to his office, Julian found his laptop screen glowing with a pulsing light. There was no sender address, only encrypted characters. He clicked the link, and a single image materialized, a black circle with a thin line through the center. It was the icon for Event Zero. Beneath it, a set of coordinates pointed to a patch of the North Sea that appeared as empty water on maps. The message was brief. The value of what you see is zero, but the value of what is hidden is everything. Join us where the light cannot reach. Julian's heart hammered. It was an invitation to a ghost auction, a place where the trillions had finally settled. To find the truth, he would have to leave the world he knew behind and step into the absolute dark. The transport was a windowless, high-speed submersible that cut through the churning grey of the North Sea with surgical precision. Julian sat in silence, hearing only the low hum of electric engines and his own erratic breathing. When the vessel surfaced, he didn't find a hidden island or a coastal palace. Instead, he looked up at the towering, rust-stained legs of a decommissioned oil rig, a skeletal metal island rising from the abyss. It was a relic of the old energy world, yet as he stepped onto the landing platform, he was met with security that rivaled a central bank. The armed guards in matte black gear used retinal scanners before ushering him into a pressurized elevator. As the doors slid open at the heart of the rig, the industrial decay vanished, replaced by a sanctuary of minimalist opulence. This was the shadow market, the final destination for the world's displaced capital. Julian walked through a gallery that held no paintings. Instead, digital terminals displayed rotating schematics of the planet. He realized with a jolt of horror that the elite were no longer interested in the aesthetic trophies of the past. In 2026, status was measured by survival and control. The items listed for bidding were sovereign assets, exclusive rights to the last unpolluted groundwater reservoirs in the Andes, dedicated satellite dead zones where no government surveillance could penetrate, and biological patents for synthetic grains. Julian felt the cold weight of the air conditioning as he stared at the glowing maps, seeing the world carved up into tiny parcels of private ownership. They were bidding on the scaffolding of human existence, turning public necessities into private monopolies. These transactions occurred in a legal vacuum, settled in proprietary stablecoins that left no trace on any public ledger. Amidst the hushed murmurs, Julian spotted a familiar silhouette standing near the central podium. His heart plummeted. It was his father, the legendary auctioneer who had supposedly retired into a life of quiet contemplation. But as Julian watched him orchestrate the room with subtle hand gestures and cold glances, the truth crystallized. His father hadn't retired. He had gone underground to design this entire ecosystem. The man who had taught Julian that the beauty of an auction was its public celebration of value had built a machine dedicated to the absolute concealment of it. Their family legacy was not one of culture, but of camouflage. Julian felt a wave of nausea. Every lesson he had learned about the art of the sale had been a preparation for this, the ultimate betrayal of the public trust. His father caught his eye for a brief second, showing no surprise, only clinical expectation. The atmosphere in the quiet room was suffocating. There were no wooden gavels or frantic shouting. Instead, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive cologne. Bidders sat at polished obsidian tables, their faces illuminated by the pale blue glow of biometric pads. A single touch confirmed a $100 million bid. Into this sterile arena stepped Marcus Vane. The tech mogul moved with predatory grace as he calculated the leverage he would hold over every battery manufacturer on Earth. Vane wasn't interested in water or satellites. His focus was singular: extraction rights. Julian watched the digital board as Vane systematically outbid a consortium of nations for the last unexploited lithium veins in the Afghan mountains. By securing these veins, Vane was effectively holding the global transition to green energy hostage. He was buying the right to dictate the survival of industry. The stakes continued to escalate until the room fell into a silence so profound Julian could hear the blood rushing in his ears. A new item appeared on the docket, and the description sent a chill through his soul. The genetic code of a sovereign nation. This wasn't a patent for a seed. It was a comprehensive database of the DNA, medical histories, and ancestral lineages of an entire island population. The elite were bidding on the right to own the blueprints of human life. Julian looked at the display, then at his father's calm face. He realized that if this sale went through, the concept of a private citizen would be erased, replaced by the property of a silent bidder. The auction was moving toward its final phase, and Julian knew he could no longer remain a witness to the dismantling of the world. Julian stared at the terminal where the genetic blueprints of thousands were being sold like common livestock. The madness had finally peaked. As an auctioneer, Julian knew the internal rhythm of the room better than anyone. He knew that an auction was a psychological war of nerves, and he knew exactly how to break it. Stealing his father's master override key from the central podium was a move born of sheer desperation, but as he slotted it into a secondary terminal, the digital scaffolding of Event Zero laid itself bare. He didn't just stop the bidding, he inverted the logic of the entire system. Using the algorithms designed for rapid-fire luxury sales, Julian began to spoof bids from Marcus Vane and the other titans, pitting their automated systems against each other in a feedback loop. The prices for the lithium rights and the genetic data spiraled upward at a sickening velocity, crossing from billions into trillions of phantom dollars. The air in the quiet room suddenly turned frigid. Digital ledgers flashed crimson as the system detected a total liquidity collapse. The proprietary stablecoins, the lifeblood of this shadow economy, were being liquidated at a rate that threatened to bankrupt every bidder within minutes. Marcus Vane surged to his feet, his face a mask of predatory fury as he watched his empire evaporate in a series of digital pulses. Julian's father moved through the chaos with a terrifying stillness, his eyes locking onto his son with a mixture of disappointment and clinical coldness. "You are burning the library just to save the books," his father hissed, his voice barely a whisper above the electronic hum of failing servers. He stood before Julian. not as a parent, but as an architect defending his masterpiece from a vandal. The world outside is a storm of transparency and populist resentment. We were the only ones keeping the flame of true value alive. We preserved the legacy of greatness from the reach of the rabble. Without us, the history of wealth simply ends. Julian didn't flinch. It was a silence he had never known in his father's house. You aren't saving culture, Father, you're embalming it. You've turned the world into a series of line items and claimed the right to own the soul of humanity. If this is the price of your secrecy, then the fire is long overdue. I'd rather see it all burned than see it owned by ghosts. With a final, decisive sequence of keystrokes, Julian executed the ultimate act of redemption. He didn't just crash the auction, he opened the gates for the world to see. The biometric profiles, the retinal scans, and the encrypted wallet addresses, every shred of data used to verify the identities of the world's most powerful shadows, was blasted across the global network. He channeled the stream directly into the very wealth trackers and AI tax engines that had driven the elite into hiding. The invisibility they had paid fortunes to secure vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by the harsh glare of public accountability. The first breach was a dull thud against the oil rig's hull. Maritime authorities were closing in fast. The room erupted into a clinical, high-speed panic. There was no shouting, only the frantic rush for the pressurized emergency submersibles. Marcus Vane was swept away by his security team, his eyes still burning with the promise of future retribution. Julian's father gave his son one last, unreadable look before disappearing into the mist of the North Sea in a specialized escape pod. They were gone, slipping away into the dark water, but they were no longer invisible. Their names, their faces, and their private transactions were now etched into every public ledger on the planet. Weeks later, Julian sat in a sunlit park. The air smelled of rain. The seized assets were frozen by global courts, and for a brief moment, the monopoly on the future had been broken. The public auction was dead, but the resources it once traded were breathing again. He looked at his phone, expecting peace. Then a haptic vibration pulsed against his palm. A new notification appeared, an encrypted invitation to a deeper, more silent layer of the economy. Julian realized the cycle was infinite. The auction had simply moved from the hall to the heart of the network. He stood up and walked toward the light, knowing that as long as there were shadows, there would always be a market for the dark.